have anything to add, now is the time to shout. Otherwise, I will go to the final group number 1. So I don't see none. So can I ask Julia to take the floor and give us the reports and the results from the group number 1?
Thank you very much. There was also an escape door, but people didn't move, so thank you very much for that. So we had a very rich discussion, and I thought it was actually quite challenging after all those great presentations in a very structured way to talk about something like innovative. So that was actually the approach we took, saying, well, how can we add to the discussion? The question was basically in the context of NDC NAPs, no? When you look at design and implementation, what are the gaps, how to overcome them, and what are some innovative solutions in some way? So some of the points, and of course they're not exhaustive, was we started saying, well, the actual challenge is, it's now, I mean, what's new if you look at NDC NAP, capacity building, from all the capacity building that is happening, and it's actually the challenge to look into the future. No? So one of the first major gaps countries have, and they reported in a group, is the ability to actually use the climate data and have national climate data so they can do their own downscaling, the modeling to understand the national circumstances. I think that's a very crucial point, and it also came up in the discussions before. The other interesting point is actually to say, well, it's actually important to do the mapping of the institutions and to understand, and when you have now the plan, the NDC, is which are the key institutions involved and what responsibilities they have, and how to actually step up from the policy, plan, prioritization to the implementation, and so there was actually one example from a country saying, well, is that actually better to have it in an existing institution? Because in many countries you have the coordinated teams, right? So different ministries come together, but since this is long term, then actually needs to be an institution in charge. So the example we had was a country who actually created a new institution for the sake of having less vested interest, to have like new people coordinating together. No? So not always new is good, but for some countries it may be a way to go ahead to kind of open up the institutional landscape a little bit. Then the other important point that was raised is that now having the plans is, how do you actually use the opportunity of having something new, something exciting? You have the Paris Agreement, and you use that new instrument to communicate climate change once again to the different levels along the vertical hierarchies, so national, subnational, community, municipality, right? To advocate on the need to act and need to build capacity, right? And to understand the gaps, of course, and to allow the engagement, because that brings us back to the key point on ownership. A very important point that was raised, and that's repeating from the other groups as well, is the question, and that also interesting comes up if you talk about longer term, because ad hoc we think, well, there can be a project, there can be a program, right? But once you talk about long term, and the lady from South Africa mentioned that, you need to have national institutions, no? You need to have researchers, universities involved, otherwise there's no way to create a sustainability. And as we all know and experience, even let's say within the UNFCCC context, no? And let alone in the country, you have a lot of fragmentation, right? So how do you overcome that? Of course, there's only part solutions, but that's definitely something this group can move forward, I guess. Next slide. So some of ideas in terms of next steps. So how do we move that forward is, one point, the first point I already mentioned, is like to define actually the drivers and define the terms of reference and eventually budget. How about that? That's actually quite important to have an institution with the budget to be able to act and build capacity. The other important point that came up, because I don't want to be too lengthy, is we had a little discussion on this question on how you track progress, right? So we have these plans, we want implementation. So how do we make sure progress is done? And then you immediately think about, okay, there's different M&E frameworks, right? So the challenge is actually, and now you have a goal, so you have many institutions, you have different indicators, targets, but we all have a common goal. So in theory, but that needs to be invented. I was told that we need to have an innovative measurement for capacity building to define in a more comprehensive, coordinated way, as we heard before, that is needed to really define the goals. So that maybe then through that we can have a clearer focus on which kind of gaps we need to target at what point of time. It may be a scaled approach, right? Because you can't do everything at the same time. So I thought that's actually quite an interesting point to consider. The other discussion we had is the incentive question, which also came up in this prep discussion, is because, I mean, in the end, we talk about change, right? So we need to have a motivation. So the motivation, it's actually at the 3 levels. It's at the level of the human person, right? It's maybe I'm capacity built, I can get promoted, I can look for like a good job, or I can work on renewables. So there's lots of incentives at a personal level. There needs to be incentive at an institutional level to build up this capacity to deliver better, right? To create this new world we're all dreaming of. And there need to be a systemic incentive to keep going, because otherwise we may have a great program, but then it's not carried forward. People change, right? So I think that's, again, something, so like in a very brainstorming way, we said, well, there's different ways in terms of looking at incentive. There's economic incentive, personal incentive, health, livelihood incentives, right? So let's look at the range of different incentives. And then, as a last point, the question, just to kind of bring the circle back in terms of promoting ownership. And then we had also a very interesting example, actually, where the person from Finland, and I hope it's okay if I mention the country, he mentioned they have a very interesting system where you have an online system where different stakeholders in the society, they would put in their commitment, they have their goals, so everybody can actually see what they're committed to, they can see whether they reach it. So it's like a public incentive to showcase that you're a change maker. And I think, I mean, that seems like a low-cost incentive, but it feeds into this whole idea of creating more transparency, to have more people acting, and it's a great multiplier for people to become change maker. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you very much for those of you who joined the group number 1. And if those of you from the group number 1, if you want to add something, definitely, if you are determined to do so, now is the time to shout. Otherwise, we are moving towards the closing session. Thank you. And first of all, I would like to thank all 3 discussion leaders to coordinate and lead the discussions in each respective groups, and also for those of you, all of you, who participated very actively in the discussions. And in my mind, what I've been pick up like on the whole, like a picture for the 1, 2, 3, but not in this like a numerical order. First of all, keywords would be, I would say, simplicity, need for the local involvement, and I would say another thing is maybe bridging national local governments, and also the ownership. But among these 3 or 4 points, I can even say more, but this is not